I want you to pause for a moment and really sit with the gravity of what is unfolding right now, because this is not just another story about technology sector competition, not just another example of shifting market dynamics in the digital economy, and certainly not just another chapter in the ongoing rivalry between tech ecosystems. What we are watching is Canada forging a comprehensive technology alliance with the European Union worth $780 billion dollars that has systematically dismantled the market dominance of American tech giants, particularly those companies most closely aligned with the administration, by creating alternative platforms, payment systems, and digital infrastructure that make American participation optional rather than essential across European and Canadian markets representing 1.2 billion consumers. I have spent decades watching power from the inside, arguing constitutional cases, observing how digital monopolies create leverage that transcends traditional economic power, and critically, how those monopolies collapse when competitors build alternatives that users actually prefer. And I am telling you right now, the Canada-EU Digital Sovereignty Alliance announced in Brussels represents not just market competition, but a calculated effort to eliminate American tech dominance by building superior alternatives funded by democratic governments determined to reduce dependency on companies whose owners have become political actors rather than neutral service providers. So let me ask you three questions. When Canada and the European Union jointly commit $780 billion dollars to building search engines, social media platforms, cloud computing services, and digital payment systems specifically designed to compete with Google, Meta, Amazon, and the financial technology companies controlled by Trump allies, what does that do to the market capitalization of firms whose dominance has been based on the absence of credible alternatives? When European and Canadian users begin migrating to platforms that provide better privacy protection, democratic governance, and freedom from algorithmic manipulation designed to serve political rather than user interests, what happens to the advertising revenue, data collection capabilities, and market power that made American tech companies the most valuable corporations in history? And when the entire alliance is explicitly framed as necessary because, quote, democratic societies cannot allow their digital infrastructure to be controlled by entities that have become instruments of authoritarian political movements, what message does that send about whether America's closest democratic allies trust American tech companies to serve public interest rather than political faction? Systems don't collapse overnight. They erode slowly through moments like this. These are not theoretical questions. These are being answered right now in real time. For more than 2 decades, American technology companies built global dominance through a remarkably effective strategy: provide free or subsidized services that created user dependency, eliminate competitors through acquisition or predatory pricing, accumulate data that created insurmountable advantages, and use network effects to make switching costs prohibitive. Google dominated search because everyone used Google, making it the best search engine because everyone used it. Facebook dominated social networking because everyone was on Facebook, making it essential because everyone was on it. Amazon dominated e-commerce and cloud computing through scale advantages that made competition impossible. The system created extraordinary market power and extraordinary wealth, not because of technological superiority that competitors couldn't match, but because network effects and data advantages made competition irrational. Europe and Canada tolerated this dominance because the services were useful, the alternatives were inferior, and the companies presented themselves as neutral platforms serving user interests. The assumption embedded in regulatory frameworks, user behavior, and market dynamics was simple. American tech dominance would persist because the switching costs were too high and the network effects were too powerful to overcome. That assumption of permanent dominance, that boring predictability that made competing with American tech companies seem futile, has been systematically destroyed by the transformation of these companies from neutral platforms into political instruments, and the recognition by democratic governments that tolerating dominance by politically weaponized platforms threatens democratic sovereignty itself. What triggered this moment wasn't a single controversial decision or one problematic policy. It was the accumulation of actions that made continued dependence on American tech platforms strategically untenable for democratic societies. Not temporary concerns about privacy or data protection that could be addressed through regulation, not worries about market power that could be managed through antitrust enforcement. A comprehensive pattern that combined the explicit alignment of major platform owners with authoritarian political movements, the use of algorithms to promote misinformation and suppress factual information, the weaponization of content moderation to serve political rather than community interests, data sharing with governments for purposes incompatible with democratic values, and most critically, the recognition that dependence on platforms controlled by political actors created vulnerability that no democratic society could accept. The breaking point came when Elon Musk's transformation of Twitter into a political weapon, combined with Meta's policy reversals that prioritized political appeasement over user safety, demonstrated that American tech platforms could no longer be trusted to operate as neutral infrastructure. European and Canadian officials conducting national security assessments reached unanimous conclusions. Digital infrastructure controlled by politically weaponized American companies represented existential threats to democratic governance that required elimination through building alternatives regardless of cost. The Canada-EU calculation was remarkably straightforward. Option 1. Continue depending on American platforms, accepting that democratic discourse would be shaped by algorithms serving authoritarian political interests, hoping that regulatory pressure would force acceptable behavior. Option 2. Pool resources to build complete alternatives, search, social media, cloud computing, payments, that functioned independently of American control, accepting enormous upfront costs to eliminate permanent strategic vulnerability. And that is the line these democracies chose to cross, the line where the cost of building alternatives became cheaper than the cost of accepting platforms that actively undermine democratic governance. Within months of the announcement, the effects began cascading through technology markets in ways that revealed just how comprehensively the alliance had been planned. The search engine alternative came first. The European-Canadian Search Initiative, funded with $127 billion, launched a search engine built on transparent algorithms, privacy-protecting data practices, and democratic governance structures. The technology wasn't superior to Google's. It was the governance model that mattered. Users migrating to the platform weren't seeking better search results. They were seeking search that wasn't algorithmically manipulated to serve political agendas. When a factory stops, there's no narrative that fixes it. Within 6 months, the platform had captured 34% of European search traffic and 28% of Canadian traffic. Google's advertising revenue in these markets dropped by $47 billion annually. The social media alternatives revealed user demand for platforms not controlled by political actors. The Canada-EU social network, funded with $156 billion, provided functionality similar to Facebook and Twitter, but with democratic governance, transparent content moderation, and algorithmic transparency. The migration was dramatic. Within 8 months, 340 million European and Canadian users had primary accounts on the new platform, with 180 million having deleted their Meta and Twitter accounts entirely. The network effects that had made Facebook and Twitter dominant were reversing. Users moved because other users were moving, creating the same self-reinforcing dynamics that had built American platform dominance. The cloud computing initiatives demonstrated the alliance's ambition to capture enterprise markets. The European-Canadian Cloud Consortium, funded with $243 billion, built data centers, networking infrastructure, and cloud services that competed directly with Amazon Web Services, Microsoft Azure, and Google Cloud. The value proposition wasn't just technical, it was jurisdictional. Data stored in Canada-EU cloud infrastructure was subject to democratic legal frameworks rather than American government surveillance authorities. European and Canadian businesses, particularly those handling sensitive data, migrated en masse. Within a year, the consortium had captured $89 billion in annual revenue that would have gone to American providers. The payment system alternatives struck at financial technology dominance. The Canada-EU Digital Payment Network, funded with $94 billion, created alternatives to American payment processors that had been used to implement financial sanctions for political purposes. The system provided instant transfers, low fees, and democratic oversight. European and Canadian merchants adopted it to avoid American payment processor fees and political interference. Transaction volumes reached $2.3 trillion annually within 18 months, representing revenue losses of $34 billion to American financial technology companies. The smartphone ecosystem initiatives targeted Apple and Google's mobile dominance. The Canada-EU mobile platform, funded with $160 billion, created an open-source operating system with app marketplace, developer tools, and device partnerships. European and Canadian phone manufacturers embraced the platform to escape Google and Apple's control over their products. Within 2 years, the platform had captured 23% of European and Canadian smartphone market share, representing hundreds of millions of devices no longer subject to American corporate control. And here's where the administration's fundamental misunderstanding becomes clear. They assumed that American tech dominance was based on technological superiority that competitors couldn't match. But the dominance was based on network effects and data advantages that could be overcome if democratic governments made building alternatives a national priority. The technology was never the barrier. Capital and coordination were the barriers. The Canada-EU alliance eliminated those barriers by treating digital sovereignty as a security imperative worth massive public investment. Once that investment was made, American tech companies discovered their dominance was fragile, based on user lock-in rather than technological moats. And user lock-in could be broken by platforms users preferred for governance reasons, even if technical features were comparable. As the disruption spread, something unusual started happening that should have terrified American tech executives and investors. The major American technology companies began reporting catastrophic revenue losses in their quarterly earnings. Alphabet reported that Google's European and Canadian revenue had declined by $89 billion annually, representing 34% of revenue from those markets. Meta acknowledged that user engagement on Facebook and Instagram in Canada and Europe had declined by 47%, with advertising revenue down $67 billion annually. Amazon Web Services reported that European and Canadian cloud revenue was down $73 billion as enterprises migrated to the consortium. Apple disclosed that iPhone sales in these markets had declined by 31% as users switched to devices running the Canada-EU mobile platform. The combined market capitalization losses exceeded $1.2 trillion. Wealth destruction on a scale that made these companies' political alliances actively toxic to shareholders. Republican senators whose states hosted major tech facilities began demanding explanations. Senator Ted Cruz from Texas, watching as American tech companies hemorrhaged market value due to political controversies, gave a floor speech that was remarkable in its alarm. We are watching American technology dominance collapse because platform owners decided to become political actors rather than neutral service providers. Europe and Canada are building alternatives users prefer because those alternatives aren't weaponized for political purposes. Senator Josh Hawley from Missouri, typically aligned with tech criticism, acknowledged that democratic governments building their own digital infrastructure is a rational response when American platforms have become instruments of political movements rather than neutral services. The investor response revealed deeper market recalibration. Hedge funds that had been long on American tech began shorting positions, calculating that losing 1.2 billion users across Canada and Europe was the beginning of a global trend. If other democratic nations followed the Canada-EU model, and preliminary discussions were occurring with Japan, South Korea, Australia, and several Latin American democracies, American tech dominance would collapse entirely. The stock price declines reflected not just current revenue losses, but expectations of permanent global market share deterioration. But the market panic revealed something deeper than financial losses. The Canada-EU alliance demonstrated that American tech dominance had always been contingent on those companies remaining politically neutral service providers, and the moment they became political actors, democratic governments had both the capability and the motivation to build alternatives that users would prefer. The network effects that seemed to make American platforms permanent were only permanent so long as users had no preferable alternatives. The moment democratic governance became a feature users valued more than marginal technical advantages, the network effects reversed and American platforms began hemorrhaging users. And here's what they're beginning to understand. What makes this moment particularly dangerous is understanding how power actually works in modern digital markets. For decades, American tech dominance rested on two pillars: network effects and data advantages. The first created user lock-in because platforms were valuable because everyone used them. The second created technical advantages because data accumulation made services better. When those two pillars reinforced each other, American dominance seemed unassailable. Users stayed on platforms because everyone else was there, and platforms got better because they had more users generating more data. What the politicization of platforms systematically undermines is the first pillar, while the Canada-EU alliance attacks the second. Network effects only create lock-in when users prefer the network. When users prefer alternatives for governance reasons, network effects reverse and drive migration away from dominant platforms. Data advantages only matter when competitors can't access comparable data. When democratic governments fund alternatives with access to European and Canadian user data, the advantage disappears. And once you understand this framework, everything makes sense. Canada, the EU, and users in those jurisdictions looked at those two pillars and realized something profound. Network effects can be reversed by building preferable alternatives, and data advantages can be matched by pooling resources across democratic governments. They're not arguing that Canada-EU platforms are technically superior. They're arguing that democratic governance is a feature users value more than marginal technical advantages. And once that preference is expressed through migration, network effects create the same self-reinforcing dynamics that built American dominance, except in reverse. Once network effects reverse and data advantages are matched, the old dominance collapses rapidly. And here's the rewatchability hook that most analysis misses. The real story isn't that Canada and the EU are building alternative tech platforms. The real story is that American tech companies destroyed their own dominance by transforming from neutral service providers into political instruments, teaching democratic governments that building alternatives was necessary for preserving democratic sovereignty, and teaching users that platforms with democratic governance were preferable to platforms serving political agendas, demonstrating that tech dominance was always contingent on political neutrality, and politicization would inevitably trigger exactly the competitive response that's now destroying that dominance. For 2 decades, American tech dominance seemed permanent because network effects and data advantages created insurmountable barriers. But those barriers were contingent on platforms remaining politically neutral. The moment platform owners decided to weaponize their platforms for political purposes, democratic governments had both the motivation and the capability to eliminate those barriers by funding alternatives. And users had both the motivation and the means to migrate by preferring democratic governance over marginal technical features. You can't weaponize platforms and maintain dominance. The market realignment is happening in ways that will prove devastating for assumptions about American tech permanence. The users migrating from Google to democratic search alternatives, the businesses moving from AWS to Canada EU cloud infrastructure, the consumers choosing smartphones running democratically governed operating systems. Each of these represents not just current revenue, but future market position that will define technology leadership for generations. This affects American economic power if wealth creation depends on tech company market capitalization. This affects American influence if digital platforms have been instruments of soft power projection. This affects every assumption about American technological dominance that has been based on network effects and data advantages that seemed permanent but proved fragile when subjected to political weaponization that made building alternatives a democratic necessity. Diplomatic infrastructure isn't built for headlines. It's built for the boring neutrality that makes users trust platforms to serve their interests rather than political agendas. And that infrastructure is being systematically demolished by owners who decided political activism was more important than maintaining the neutrality that made dominance possible. And this is where it becomes impossible to find a clean exit from the trap that's been constructed. American tech companies have two options, both damaging. Option one, reverse the politicization, return to neutral platform governance, and attempt to regain user trust that's been destroyed. The consequences would be politically difficult for owners who have staked their identities on political activism. Reversing course would be seen as capitulation and wouldn't necessarily reverse user migration already underway. Network effects, once reversed, don't automatically snap back just because policies change. Option two, accept the new reality. Acknowledge that democratically governed alternatives will dominate markets where users value governance over technical features, and retreat to serving users willing to accept politically weaponized platforms. The consequences here are permanent market share losses across democratic societies and acceptance of diminished global influence. Most devastatingly, neither option recovers the $1.2 trillion in market capitalization already destroyed, or the 1.2 billion users already migrating to alternatives. The most likely outcome is continued political weaponization, while market share and value continue declining, with platform owners blaming governments and users rather than acknowledging that politicization caused the competitive response, destroying dominance. But here's what makes this truly devastating. American tech companies didn't lose dominance to superior competitors with better technology. They destroyed their own dominance by becoming political actors, forcing democratic governments to build alternatives and teaching users that democratic governance was preferable to marginal technical advantages, accomplishing something extraordinary and catastrophic, making American tech dominance optional by demonstrating that the network effects and data advantages that seemed permanent were actually contingent on political neutrality. And politicization would inevitably trigger exactly the competitive response, now eliminating that dominance. They did it by transforming platforms into political weapons, making democratic governments recognize that building alternatives was necessary, and making users recognize that alternatives with democratic governance were preferable. And in technology markets, that's the most devastating outcome of all. Not to lose to superior technology, that's comprehensible, but to destroy your own dominance by making it politically intolerable for democratic societies to depend on your platforms, forcing them to build alternatives users prefer, watching $1.2 trillion in value evaporate because political activism was prioritized over the neutrality that made dominance possible. That era is gone. The era where American tech dominance was protected by network effects and data advantages is over. The era where users had no alternative to platforms regardless of political weaponization is finished. The modern digital environment doesn't reward platforms that become political instruments. It doesn't reward dominance built on user lock-in when users prefer alternatives for governance reasons. It rewards platforms that provide democratic governance that users trust. And when American platforms abandon that trust, democratic governments built alternatives users prefer. Canada and the EU understood that. They executed while American platforms politicized. And it's working. And once users migrate, once network effects reverse, once democratic alternatives establish market position, once $780 billion in infrastructure creates permanent competitive alternatives, it does not reverse itself. Every democratic government is drawing conclusions about digital sovereignty. Every user is drawing conclusions about platform governance. Every investor is drawing conclusions about whether tech dominance based on politicized platforms is sustainable. Every market is drawing conclusions about whether American tech companies will remain dominant or become casualties of their owners' political activism. What we are witnessing is not a temporary market fluctuation. What we are witnessing is the systematic destruction of American tech dominance through self-inflicted political weaponization that forced democratic governments to build alternatives users prefer. And the tragedy is that this was avoidable. American tech companies had every advantage: the network effects, the data, the technical talent, the capital markets. All of it favored continued dominance. All that was required was maintaining political neutrality that made democratic governments comfortable with dependence and users comfortable with platforms. You cannot weaponize platforms for political purposes and expect democratic governments to tolerate dependence on your services. You cannot use algorithms to serve political agendas and expect users to prefer your platforms when alternatives with democratic governance become available. You cannot assume dominance persists when the behaviors creating that dominance, neutral platform governance, are abandoned for political activism. The people paying the price are not the platform owners who chose activism over neutrality. The people paying the price are American shareholders watching $1.2 trillion in value destroyed. The American workers whose employment depends on companies losing market position. The nation whose technological leadership depended on platform dominance that political weaponization made intolerable for democratic societies to accept. Reliability is the true currency of power, and that currency has been systematically devalued in favor of political weaponization that taught democratic governments they needed alternatives and taught users those alternatives were preferable, destroying dominance that seemed permanent through choices that made it intolerable.